A gate agent holds the power to ruin your day, to make you miss a wedding, a funeral, a life-changing meeting. For Dr. Mason Parker and Dr. Daisy Hayes, a gate agent at Chicago O'Hare tried to do just that. She saw a black couple she deemed unworthy of their first-class tickets and decided to make an example of them. She humiliated them, belittled them, and ultimately denied them boarding in front of a crowd of strangers. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that her two victims weren't just passengers. They were federal inspectors from the FAA, and they had the power to bring an entire airline to its knees. This isn't just a story about discrimination. It's a story of what happens when absolute power meets immovable authority. The air in Terminal 3 of Chicago O'Hare International Airport was thick with the usual symphony of chaos. The rolling thunder of suitcases on tile, the cacophony of final boarding calls for flights to cities you'd never heard of, and the low, anxious hum of thousands of people in transit. It was a controlled storm, and for Dr. Mason Parker and Dr. Daisy Hayes, it was simply the backdrop to the end of a long but successful week. They stood near the boarding area for Trans-American Airways Flight 1142 to Washington, D.C. They were dressed in what could be described as business travel camouflage, comfortable yet professional. Mason, tall and broad-shouldered, wore a tailored grey blazer over a simple black t-shirt, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the frantic energy around him. Daisy, sharp and elegant in a navy blue pantsuit, was scrolling through emails on her phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. To any casual observer, they were just another successful couple, perhaps lawyers or consultants, heading home after a week of meetings. The casual observer would be spectacularly wrong. Mason and Daisy were senior investigators for the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Audit and Evaluation. Their job was not to fix planes, but to fix the systems and people who did. They were the auditor's auditors, the ones sent in when an airline's internal processes were suspected of being dangerously flawed. They had spent the last 5 days in a windowless conference room, dissecting the maintenance logs and safety protocols of a regional carrier, their minds steeped in the intricate language of federal aviation regulations. Now, all they wanted was the quiet comfort of their first-class seats, a glass of wine, and the 3-hour flight that would deliver them back to their own bed. Their tickets were a perk of the job, not a luxury they sought out. The government contract stipulated business or first-class travel for cross-country assignments, a small concession for the grueling hours and immense pressure. They rarely thought about it, but today, the extra legroom felt like a necessity. "See anything interesting?" Mason asked, his voice a low baritone that always seemed to calm the space around him. Daisy looked up from her phone, a slight smile touching her lips. "Just Harrison wanting the preliminary report by Aero 800 tomorrow. He seems to think we don't need to sleep." Mason chuckled. Harrison has been running on pure ambition since 1998. Sleep is a competitive disadvantage. They shared a look of mutual understanding, the kind forged over a decade of shared high-stakes work and a deep, abiding love. They were a team in every sense of the word. At the podium, the gate agent, a woman with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Brenda, was already showing signs of fraying. Her voice, amplified by the PA system, was sharp and laced with impatience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be starting the pre-boarding process for Trans-American Flight 1142 to Washington Reagan shortly. Please have your boarding passes and a valid government-issued photo ID ready. I will not repeat myself. If you are not ready when I call your group, you will go to the back of the line." She handled the microphone like a weapon, her gaze sweeping over the waiting passengers with a look of undisguised disdain. She snapped at a young mother who asked if she could gate-check her stroller, and curtly dismissed an elderly man who was confused about his zone number. Mason watched her, a small, almost imperceptible frown line appearing between his brows. In his line of work, he was a professional people watcher, an analyst of human systems. An airport gate was a complex system, and the agent was its primary control point. A stressed, erratic control point was a vulnerability. "She seems a bit on edge," Daisy murmured, having noticed Mason's focus. "End of a long shift," Mason replied, giving her the benefit of the doubt. "We've all been there." The pre-boarding call came for active duty military and families with small children. Then Brenda's voice crackled again. "We will now begin boarding first class. First class passengers only." Mason and Daisy gathered their carry-on bags and joined the short line. They were the third and fourth passengers to approach the podium. The couple in front of them, a white man and woman in their late 50s, were greeted with a practiced, if thin, smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Jensen. Enjoy your flight." Brenda scanned their passes with a flick of her wrist. Then it was their turn. Daisy stepped forward and handed over her phone with the digital boarding pass displayed, along with her driver's license. Brenda took the phone without making eye contact. Her eyes flickered from the screen to Daisy's face, then back to the screen. The thin smile vanished, replaced by a pursed-lipped skepticism. "This is for Washington Reagan?" she asked, her tone accusatory, as if Daisy might have gotten the entire city wrong. "Yes, flight 1142, Daisy replied, her voice even and pleasant. Brenda tapped aggressively at her screen. "The system is being slow." She looked up, her eyes finally meeting Daisy's, and for the first time, she seemed to truly see them. She took in Daisy's smart pantsuit, Mason standing calmly behind her, and a flicker of something ugly and dismissive crossed her face. "I'm going to need to see your original confirmation," Brenda said, her voice now flat and cold. "And your ID again." Daisy slid her license across the counter again. "The confirmation email is on my phone. I can pull it up. Is there a problem?" "I'm the one who determines if there's a problem," Brenda snapped, her voice rising just enough for the people behind them in line to notice. "And right now, this seat assignment seems to be frozen. It happens sometimes." Mason stepped forward slightly. "It's a standard government fare booking. Perhaps you could try typing in the confirmation number manually," he suggested, keeping his tone helpful. Brenda's head whipped around to face him. "Sir, I know how to do my job. Are you the other passenger?" She gestured dismissively at his boarding pass. He handed it over. She scanned his pass, and her eyes widened in theatrical disbelief. "Well, what do you know? Another frozen seat. How coincidental." The word coincidental hung in the air, heavy with insinuation. The line behind them was growing longer. The Jensens, who had been waiting on the jet bridge, glanced back with curiosity. Mason and Daisy exchanged a quick, almost invisible glance. The long, peaceful flight home was beginning to feel very far away. The storm had arrived. The space around the boarding podium had become a silent theatre. Passengers in the now stalled line craned their necks, their expressions ranging from impatience to mild curiosity. For Brenda, this audience seemed to fuel her sense of authority. She was no longer just a gate agent. She was the guardian of the gate, and she had found a threat. "So, both of your first-class seats, booked on the same reservation, are suddenly causing a system error," Brenda announced, her voice loud enough for everyone in Zone 1 to hear. "I find that very hard to believe." Daisy maintained her composure, a lifetime of navigating such encounters, hardening her resolve into a calm, unbreakable shell. "I assure you, our tickets are valid. We fly this route often for work. If the scanner is malfunctioning, perhaps you could issue paper tickets." I'm not issuing anything until I can verify these, Brenda said, tapping her acrylic nail on their phones, which now sat on the counter like pieces of contraband evidence. You people are always trying to find a way around the system. The phrase, "you people," struck the air like a match. It was a classic, cowardly grenade of a microaggression designed to inflict maximum damage while maintaining a veneer of plausible deniability. Mason's jaw tightened, but his expression remained a mask of neutrality. He had learned long ago that reacting with anger was a losing game. It was what they wanted, the excuse they needed to escalate. "Ma'am," Mason said, his voice low and firm, "I'm not sure what you mean by 'you people.' We are passengers with valid tickets for this flight. We would appreciate it if you would process our boarding passes." "And I would appreciate it if you would lower your tone," Brenda retorted instantly, her eyes flashing. "You're becoming aggressive, and that is not tolerated here." It was a textbook maneuver. Accuse the victim of the very aggression you are perpetrating. Several people in the line shuffled their feet uncomfortably. A young man in a university sweatshirt, standing a few feet away, had his phone angled slightly downwards, the red dot of a recording light subtly glowing. From behind the desk, a man in a slightly ill-fitting manager's uniform emerged. He was in his late 40s, with a perpetually worried expression and a name tag that read, "Gary." "Is there a problem here, Brenda?" he asked, though he directed his question more to the scene than to her specifically. "Yes, Gary," Brenda said, her voice taking on a martyred tone. "This couple's tickets won't scan. I suspect they're fraudulent, and they're becoming very agitated and aggressive with me. They're holding up the entire boarding process." Gary looked at Mason and Daisy, his eyes skating over them without ever really making contact. He saw their clothes, their posture, and then he looked at Brenda, his trusted, long-term employee. He made a calculation based on 1,000 tiny biases. "Folks, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," Gary said, his voice a bland, corporate monotone. "We can't hold up a flight for a ticketing issue." "It's not a ticketing issue," Daisy stated clearly. "It's a processing issue on your end. We are confirmed on this flight. You can look up our names, Dr. Daisy Hayes and Dr. Mason Parker." The titles seemed to annoy Brenda more than anything. "Oh, doctor, is it?" she sneered under her breath, just loud enough for them to hear. Gary, however, focused on the operational problem. "Brenda is my most experienced agent. If she says there's a problem with the ticket, there's a problem. Now please, step to the side. We'll look into it after the flight has departed." The implication was clear. They were not getting on this plane. "That's unacceptable," Mason said, his voice dropping to a register that conveyed absolute seriousness. "You are denying us boarding without cause. According to your own contract of carriage, and I might add, federal regulations, you cannot arbitrarily deny boarding to confirmed passengers without a valid reason, such as a security threat or an oversold flight, in which case a specific compensation protocol must be followed." He had recited it calmly, almost academically. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. But to Gary and Brenda, this calm recitation of the rules was more infuriating than shouting would have been. It challenged their authority on their own turf. "Are you threatening me?" Gary puffed up his chest slightly. "Are you an attorney?" "I'm a passenger who knows the rules," Mason replied, his gaze unwavering. "Well, I'm the station manager, and I'm telling you that you are a disruptive presence at this gate," Gary declared, his voice rising. "Your tone is confrontational, and you've upset my agent. That's all the reason I need. You are officially denied boarding on Flight 1142. Brenda, close the flight out. Let's get these people in the air." Brenda looked triumphant. With a dramatic flourish, she picked up the microphone. "Final boarding call for Flight 1142. She began scanning the remaining passengers through with exaggerated speed and courtesy, her smile a weapon aimed directly at Mason and Daisy. They were left standing there, just feet from the jet bridge, utterly dismissed. The other first-class passengers were now seated. The economy passengers shuffled past, most avoiding eye contact, a few shooting them looks of pity, others of annoyance. One older woman whispered, "That's just shameful," to her husband, but not loud enough for the agents to hear. The humiliation was a palpable thing, a hot, metallic taste in the back of their throats. But beneath the anger and the sting of injustice, a different part of their minds was already working. They were no longer just wronged passengers. They were investigators, and this was now a scene. They observed everything: Brenda's smug expression, Gary's nervous glances, the model of the computer terminal, the placement of the CCTV cameras. The jet bridge door was about to be closed. It was the point of no return. Daisy turned to Mason. "They've made their final decision," she said softly, her voice devoid of its earlier warmth, now clipped and professional. "Yes, they have," Mason agreed, his eyes like polished stones. He pulled out his phone, but not to look at his defunct boarding pass. He scrolled through his contacts to a number that wasn't on any public directory. "What are you doing?" Gary asked suspiciously, seeing the phone. "Calling your lawyer? Go right ahead." Mason ignored him. He found the contact he was looking for. He didn't make a call. He sent a simple 2-word text message to a secure number. Code 7. A moment later, his phone buzzed. The reply was a single letter. Y. "It's time," Mason said to Daisy. He looked past Gary and Brenda, his gaze fixed on the cockpit door, visible at the end of the jet bridge. "Let's introduce ourselves." The final thump of the overhead bin doors echoed down the jet bridge. Brenda stood with her hand on the heavy door, ready to close out the flight and seal her victory. She shot a final, smug glance at Mason and Daisy, who stood not defeated, but unnervingly still, by the podium. Gary was already turning his attention to the paperwork, eager to put the unpleasantness behind him. "You're going to have to clear the gate area," Gary said, without looking up. "You can take up your complaint with customer service." "I don't think so," Mason said, his voice calm but carrying a new and unfamiliar weight of command. "We won't be speaking to customer service. But you will be." He then raised his voice slightly, directing it toward the open aircraft door. "Excuse me, flight crew, may we have a word with the captain, please?" Brenda scoffed. "The captain? He's not coming out here for you. He's busy. We're about to push back." She moved to close the door, but a firm voice stopped her. "Leave it." Captain David Harris appeared at the end of the jet bridge. He was a man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the easy, unquestionable authority that comes from 30 years of landing multi-ton machines in crosswinds. His pilot's uniform was immaculate. He looked from Mason and Daisy to his gate agents, his expression one of professional annoyance at the delay. "What's the problem here?" he asked, his voice a no-nonsense baritone. "We're 10 minutes behind schedule." "No problem, Captain Harris," Gary said quickly, stepping forward. "Just a couple of passengers who had a ticketing issue. We've handled it. Brenda is closing the door now." Captain Harris's eyes fell on Mason and Daisy. He saw no hysteria, no wild-eyed anger. He saw two composed, well-dressed individuals who looked more like federal prosecutors than unruly passengers. He was a good reader of people, a necessary skill in his profession. Something didn't add up. "What was the ticketing issue?" he asked, his question directed not at his ground staff, but at Mason. "There wasn't one, Captain," Mason replied respectfully. "Your agents here denied us boarding, based on what they called our aggressive tone. After we questioned why our valid, confirmed first-class boarding passes were not scanning. Harris's gaze shifted to Brenda, one eyebrow slightly raised. He knew Brenda. He'd flown out of her gates for years. He knew she could be difficult. Brenda. Their passes were fraudulent, Captain, she insisted, her voice shrill. The system flagged them. They were causing a scene. The system flagged nothing, Daisy said, her voice cutting through the noise with surgical precision. The system was, as you put it, being slow. We have the full email confirmation, the receipt of purchase on a government travel card, and our federal government credentials. At the mention of federal government credentials, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Gary's face. But Brenda, too deep in her narrative of righteous authority, doubled down. They're lying. They never said anything about being government employees, she spat. We didn't think we had to, Mason said. He took a deliberate step forward toward Captain Harris. Gary instinctively moved to block him. Sir, I'm going to warn you one last time. Mason paid him no mind. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a slim, dark blue leather wallet. He didn't flash it. He opened it with a quiet, deliberate motion. Captain Harris, he said, his voice now devoid of any pleading or complaint. It was the voice of pure, unassailable authority. My name is Dr. Mason Parker. This is my associate, Dr. Daisy Hayes. We are senior safety and compliance investigators with the Federal Aviation Administration. He held up the wallet. Inside, behind a protective pane, was a gold badge depicting an eagle over a shield, and a photo ID card with his picture, the seal of the Department of Transportation, and the bold letters, Federal Aviation Administration. The universe at Gate C-27 of Chicago O'Hare tilted on its axis. The color drained from Brenda's face. Her jaw went slack, her smugness evaporating into sheer, unadulterated terror. Gary stared at the credentials, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish. He looked from the ID to Mason's face, and the man he had seen as a disruptive presence just moments before now looked 10 feet tall. Captain Harris's professional annoyance instantly transformed into grave seriousness. He had been trained for this. Every pilot, every flight attendant, every agent knew what it meant when an FAA inspector identified themselves on site. It was the aviation equivalent of the sky turning black. He looked at Mason and then at Daisy, who produced her own identical credentials. He gave them a short, respectful nod. Doctors. I see. What are your badge numbers? Mine is 7714, Mason said. Dr. Hayes is 7715. Harris pulled out his own phone and made a quick call. This is Captain Harris of TAA 1142 at ORD Gate C-27. I need to verify an FAA credential. Badge number 7714, Parker, and 7715, Hayes. Yes, I'll hold. The silence at the gate was deafening. The few remaining passengers waiting for other flights were now watching, sensing the seismic shift in power. Brenda was trembling, her hand gripping the counter to stay upright. Gary was sweating profusely, his tie suddenly looking like a noose. After a few seconds, Harris spoke into the phone. Confirmed. Office of Audit and Evaluation. Thank you. He hung up and slipped the phone back into his pocket. His gaze, now glacial, fell upon his ground crew. Brenda, Gary, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Step away from the podium. Do not touch the computer. Do not speak to anyone. You are to wait right here. He turned back to Mason and Daisy. My apologies for my crew's behavior, doctors. The aircraft and its crew are at your disposal. What are your instructions? The question hung in the air, a formal surrender. Mason and Daisy were no longer the accused. They were the judges. Captain, Mason began, his voice ringing with the clarity of a bell in the now silent terminal. "Your flight is not a priority at the moment. Our priority is the gross violation of federal regulations that just occurred at this gate. As of this moment, 14:32 Central Time, consider this gate an active federal investigation site. TAA Flight 1142 is officially grounded." The word "grounded" detonated in the quiet of the gate area. For the passengers already on board Flight 1142, it would mean an inconvenient delay. For Trans-American Airways, it was the first tremor of an earthquake. For Brenda and Gary, it was the sound of their careers, and quite possibly their lives, imploding. Brenda let out a small, strangled gasp. Gary looked like he might be physically ill. Captain Harris, however, simply nodded. He understood protocol. He turned to his first officer, who had been watching from the jet bridge. "Paul, inform the tower we're grounded indefinitely. FAA directive. Then make the announcement to the passengers. No details, just an unforeseen ground delay. Tell the flight attendants to prepare for deplaning." "Yes, sir," the first officer said, disappearing back into the plane with a sense of urgency. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a tectonic event. Mason and Daisy were no longer victims of discrimination. They were Dr. Parker and Dr. Hayes of the FAA, and they were now in charge. Their professionalism, which had been misconstrued as aggression, was now revealed for what it was. The calm, focused demeanor of federal investigators at work. Daisy spoke first, her voice crisp and clear. "Gary, is it Gary Peterson?" she asked, having read his name tag. Gary flinched as if she'd struck him. "Yes, ma'am," he stammered. "Mr. Peterson, I need you to contact airport security, not TSA. I need the airport police department. Inform them that FAA investigators require their presence at gate C-27 to secure a scene. Do it now." Yes, ma'am." Gary fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking so badly he could barely press the button. Mason turned his attention to the shell-shocked Brenda. "Brenda Walsh," he said, reading her tag. "You will not touch that computer. You will not delete any logs. You will not communicate with anyone other than us. And you will surrender your airport ID and all trans-American property immediately." Brenda stared at him, her eyes wide with panic. I didn't. I thought." "What you thought is no longer relevant, Miss Walsh," Mason said, his voice cold and impassive. "What you did, however, is a matter of federal record. The act of denying boarding to a passenger without legitimate, documented cause is a violation of 14 CFR Part 382. When that denial is based on discriminatory animus, it elevates the severity significantly. When it interferes with the official duties of federal officers, well, that's a different stratosphere of trouble entirely." He wasn't speaking to her as a wronged passenger anymore. He was outlining the charges. Each word was a nail in the coffin of her career. 2 airport police officers arrived within minutes, their expressions serious. Daisy briefed them quickly. "We need this area secured. No one in or out without our permission. The 2 employees at the podium are not to leave. We also need all CCTV footage from this gate and the surrounding area for the last hour, sequestered immediately." "You've got it, ma'am," the senior officer replied, recognizing the gravity of the situation. The FAA was a name that commanded immediate respect and cooperation. The passengers on the plane began to deplane, their faces a mixture of confusion and frustration. As they streamed back into the terminal, they saw the scene. The gate cordoned off by police tape, the terrified agents standing like statues, and the black couple they'd seen being denied entry, now calmly directing police officers and the flight captain. The young man who had been filming approached Mason hesitantly. Sir, Dr. Parker, I got the whole thing on my phone, her yelling at you. Mason turned to him, his expression softening for the first time. Thank you. What is your name? Kevin. Kevin Luo. Kevin, your recording is now evidence in a federal investigation. We will need a copy of it, and we will need a formal statement from you. Are you willing to provide that? Absolutely, Kevin said, his eyes wide. What she did was wrong. Everyone saw it. As if on cue, the older woman who had muttered, "Shameful," also stepped forward. We saw it too. She was awful to them from the moment they stepped up. We'll give a statement. Suddenly, the silent, complicit crowd found its voice. One by one, passengers came forward to describe what they witnessed, their stories corroborating the abuse of power they had all seen. While Daisy coordinated with the airport police and took down names of witnesses, Mason turned back to Captain Harris. Captain, I need the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder logs for this aircraft for the last 24 hours. I also need the names and employee numbers of every ground crew member who has serviced or handled this plane today. Of course, Harris said. I'll get on it. He understood. This was no longer about a gate incident. Parker and Hayes were using this as a point of entry. An infection at the gate could suggest a deeper disease within the airline's operations at O'Hare. They weren't just investigating Brenda and Gary, they were now investigating Trans-American Airways. Soon, a man in an expensive suit, looking flustered and out of breath, arrived at the police line. I'm Richard Harrison, the Regional Vice President for Trans-American. I was told there was an issue with one of my flights. He tried to project an air of authority, but it faltered when he saw the FAA badges. Daisy met him at the tape. Mr. Harrison, I'm Dr. Hayes. Your issue is that your station manager and gate agent have committed multiple serious regulatory violations, grounded one of your aircraft during an active investigation, and have triggered a full-scale FAA audit of your entire O'Hare hub operations, effective immediately. Harrison's face went pale. An FAA audit was a corporate nightmare, a multi-million-dollar ordeal that could result in massive fines, loss of routes, and a public relations catastrophe. An audit for a misunderstanding at the gate? He stammered. There was no misunderstanding, Mr. Harrison, Daisy replied, her voice like ice. There was a clear-cut case of discrimination and interference with federal officers. Our investigation will determine if this is the result of 2 rogue employees or a reflection of the corporate culture you have fostered here at Trans-American. I suggest you find a conference room. My team will be arriving from the regional office within the hour, and we have a lot of work to do. She turned her back on him, leaving him to stare at the scene his employees had created. At the podium, Brenda finally broke. Sobs racked her body as the full, terrifying weight of her actions crashed down upon her. But there was no sympathy for her at gate C-27. The tables hadn't just been turned, they had been smashed to pieces. The sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room deep in the bowels of Terminal 3 became the FAA's temporary command center. What started as a personal humiliation at a boarding gate had metastasized, as Mason and Daisy knew it would, into a top-to-bottom operational audit. The initial incident was merely the symptom. Their job now was to find the disease. Their team from the FAA's Great Lakes Regional Office, a cadre of grim-faced specialists in everything from human resources protocols to maintenance log analysis, had descended on O'Hare with ruthless efficiency. The initial grounding of Flight 1142 was just the opening salvo. Mason and Daisy now sat at the head of a long table, no longer travel-weary passengers but commanders in their element. The table was littered with laptops, binders of regulations, and stacks of documents subpoenaed from Trans-American Airways. Richard Harrison, the regional VP, sat opposite them, flanked by a team of increasingly nervous-looking corporate lawyers. "Let's begin with the personnel files for Ms. Walsh and Mr. Peterson," Daisy said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "We want every performance review, every passenger complaint, every commendation, and every disciplinary action. Unredacted." A lawyer cleared his throat. "Some of that may be subject to employee privacy concerns." "Your concerns are noted," Mason cut in, not looking up from his laptop. "But they are irrelevant. Per Title 49 of the U.S. Code, our investigatory authority in matters of air safety and public transport regulation supersedes your corporate HR policies. You have 1 hour to produce those files." The files, when they arrived, told a damning story. Brenda Walsh's file was a tapestry of red flags. Over her 12 years with the airline, there had been 17 formal passenger complaints filed against her. A startling 9 of them involved passengers of color. The complaints used similar language: rude, accusatory, hostile, seemed to assume I was trying to cheat the system. Daisy read one aloud. "Ms. Walsh loudly questioned the validity of my family's tickets to Mexico, asking if we could really afford the upgraded seats we had purchased. She made us wait until every other passenger had boarded before processing our passes." This was from 2 years ago. "What was the result of this complaint, Mr. Harrison?" Harrison looked at a subordinate who shuffled papers nervously. Ms. Walsh received a verbal warning and was mandated to take an online diversity and inclusion module." "An online module," Mason repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "A 30-minute slideshow for what was clearly a pattern of racist behavior. You didn't fire her. You didn't even suspend her. You gave her homework." He then turned to Gary Peterson's file. It was different, but no less damning. Peterson had glowing performance reviews. He was praised for his efficiency, for running a tight ship, and for keeping his gate delays to a minimum. But investigators also pulled his internal emails and memos. Mason projected one onto the screen for the room to see. It was a memo from Gary to all his gate agents from 6 months prior. It read, "Team, management is coming down hard on boarding times. We need to get planes out on schedule, no exceptions. If a passenger is giving you trouble or slowing down the line, use your discretion. Better to solve the problem on the ground and let customer service sort it out later than to take a delay. I will back you up 100%. "Do you see what this is, Mr. Harrison?" Mason asked, standing and pointing at the screen. "This is not just a manager backing up his employee. This is a directive, a green light for agents like Brenda Walsh to solve the problem of any passenger she deems trouble." He created the environment for this to happen. He told her he would have her back, and when the time came, he did. This isn't just one bad apple. The rot is in the barrel. The investigation spread like a spider's web. One team audited Trans-American's training protocols and found that the diversity and inclusion training was a woefully outdated, universally mocked video from 2005. Another team analyzed years of gate-level data and discovered that passengers with non-Western-sounding names were disproportionately flagged for random secondary screenings at the O'Hare hub. The rabbit hole went deeper. The audit of Flight 1142's maintenance logs, which Mason had requested as a matter of course, turned up a separate, unrelated issue. A recurring sensor fault had been signed off on by a mechanic with an expired certification. The plane was technically not airworthy. It was a minor issue, easily fixed, but the paperwork had been pencil-whipped. It spoke to the same culture Gary's memo had revealed, a culture of cutting corners for the sake of efficiency, the culture that put schedules ahead of rules, and sometimes ahead of safety. For 3 days they worked relentlessly. They interviewed dozens of Trans-American employees at O'Hare, gate agents, baggage handlers, mechanics. Many, now speaking under federal protection from reprisal, told stories of a toxic work environment where management demanded speed above all else, and where complaints about certain problem employees like Brenda were swept under the rug because her aggression was effective at clearing the gate quickly. The personal injustice Mason and Daisy had suffered was now just Exhibit A in a mountain of evidence. They had been the perfect victims for this broken system, black, which triggered Brenda's prejudice, and calm and knowledgeable, which triggered her sense of being challenged. She couldn't have picked a worse target. On the fourth day, Mason and Daisy sat alone in the conference room after their team had left for the day. The adrenaline of the initial confrontation had long since faded, replaced by the grim satisfaction of their work. She thought she was exercising power, Daisy said, staring at the whiteboard, which was covered in a complex diagram of institutional failure. But all she was doing was exposing the weakness of the entire system she was a part of. "That's how it always is," Mason replied. "A system without accountability rots from the inside out. People like Brenda are just the fungus that grows in the dark. Our job is to drag it all into the sunlight." He looked at his wife, his partner, and saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the fierce, unyielding glint of her conviction. The incident had been ugly and painful, a sharp reminder of a reality they faced all too often. But their response, methodical, thorough, and devastatingly effective, was their true power. They weren't just bringing consequences down on two people. They were forcing an entire corporation to look in the mirror, and the reflection was not pretty. The hard karma was just beginning. The fallout from the O'Hare audit landed with the force of a Category 5 hurricane. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. For Trans-American Airways, and for the individuals who had set the disaster in motion, the grinding was about to pulverize them. Brenda Walsh was the first to go. She was fired the day after the incident, escorted from the airport property with her belongings in a cardboard box, but her ordeal was far from over. The FAA investigation officially cited her for multiple violations, including discriminatory practices and interference with the duties of a federal officer. Her file was permanently flagged. She would never work in the airline industry again, not as a gate agent, not as a baggage handler, not even as a janitor in a hangar. Every application would be met with a silent, impassable wall. News of the incident, leaked to an aviation blogger, made her name infamous in the industry. Her sneering face, captured on Kevin Luo's phone, became a meme for corporate racism. She was forced to sell her home and move to a different state to escape the notoriety, her life irrevocably shattered by a single, hate-fueled decision. Gary Peterson's fate was sealed by his own emails. He was fired for gross negligence and for fostering a culture that directly led to the violations. His "I will back you up 100% memo was the centerpiece of the FAA's report on management failures. Like Brenda, he was blacklisted from the industry he'd spent 25 years in. He tried to sue for wrongful termination, but the moment Trans-American's lawyers presented him with the evidence compiled by the FAA, he dropped the suit. He ended up as an assistant manager at a big box hardware store, a man stripped of his authority, forever haunted by the two passengers he had so arrogantly dismissed. But the consequences didn't stop at the gate level. Mason and Daisy's final report was a meticulously documented 300-page indictment of Trans-American's O'Hare operations. It detailed the systemic failures, the pattern of discrimination, the safety shortcuts like the pencil-whipped maintenance log, and the management culture that prized on-time departures over federal law. The FAA levied one of the largest fines in its history against Trans-American Airways, $18.5 million. The fine was broken down by violation, a hefty penalty for the discriminatory denial of boarding, another for the interference with federal investigators, and the largest portion for the safety and maintenance logging infractions the audit had uncovered. The message was clear: the rot found at the gate was symptomatic of a deeper, more dangerous disease. Richard Harrison, the regional vice president, was publicly forced to resign. In a press conference, the CEO of Trans-American, a man with a face like thunder, had to stand before the world and apologize. He read a stilted, lawyer-approved statement about their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and their unwavering dedication to safety. But the damage was done. The airline's stock price plummeted. News outlets replayed the story for weeks, with headlines like "Airline's Culture of Bias Exposed" and the FAA inspectors who fought back. Beyond the fines and resignations, the FAA imposed a legally binding consent decree on the airline. Trans-American was forced to completely overhaul its customer service and employee training programs nationwide, under the direct supervision of an FAA-appointed monitoring team. They had to implement new, rigorous software to track passenger complaints and flag employees like Brenda Walsh long before they became liabilities. They had to retrain every single one of their mechanics on proper logging procedures. The cost of these mandated changes ran into the tens of millions, dwarfing even the initial fine. The decree had a specific clause, reportedly insisted upon by Dr. Parker and Dr. Hayes themselves. It required every single station manager, all the way up to the vice president of domestic operations, to spend 40 hours a year working on the front lines, at the ticket counters and boarding gates. They had to experience firsthand the pressure their employees were under and witness the direct consequences of their corporate policies. The Gary Peterson memo was used as a case study in their new management training program, an example of precisely what not to do. Captain David Harris, by contrast, received a formal letter of commendation from the FAA for his professionalism and immediate cooperation. His actions were held up as the gold standard for how flight crews should respond in such a situation. The letter became a prized possession, framed on his office wall. The karma was not just about punishment. It was about a forced, painful, and brutally expensive course correction. An entire airline was brought to heel, its toxic culture ripped out at the roots, all because one gate agent couldn't fathom the idea of a black couple sitting in first class. She had tried to put them in their place, and in doing so, had given them the power to put her entire company in its. 6 months had passed since the storm at O'Hare. The biting Chicago wind had given way to the humid blanket of a Washington, D.C. summer. Inside the climate-controlled stillness of the FAA headquarters, the world was an orderly place of policy and procedure, a stark contrast to the chaotic, emotionally charged theater of the airport terminal. For Dr. Mason Parker, the incident at Gate C-27 now felt both like a lifetime ago and a wound that had just finished scarring over. It existed less as a sharp memory and more as a dense, heavy object on his desk. That object was the final closure report for the Trans-American Airways audit, designated FAA AE 2025-0411. It was nearly 3 inches thick, bound in a sober federal blue, its sheer physical weight a testament to the thousands of man-hours, the careers dismantled, and the corporate foundation that had been shaken to its core. It was a monument to a single, ugly moment of prejudice that had been allowed to fester in the dark corners of corporate culture. Mason was on page 287, reading a field report from the FAA monitor assigned to oversee the implementation of the consent decree at the O'Hare hub. The monitor, a no-nonsense veteran named Henderson, had written, "Observed a notable shift in gate-level conflict resolution. On Tuesday, a Zone 2 passenger became belligerent over a lack of overhead bin space. The new station manager, Ms. Albright, personally de-escalated the situation, rebooked the passenger on the next flight at no cost, and provided a meal voucher, citing the new Passenger Bill of Rights protocol. The employee who had initially engaged the passenger was debriefed afterward, not punitively, but as a training exercise. This is a 180-degree departure from the manager backs the agent no matter what culture previously documented. A small, grimly satisfied smile touched Mason's lips. This was the fruit of their labor. It wasn't the multi-million-dollar fines or the public resignations that signified true victory. It was this: a single, positive interaction in a sea of potential conflicts, a small gear in a massive machine turning correctly for the first time in a long time. The machine was being fixed. Daisy entered his office, her presence a familiar comfort. She carried 2 ceramic mugs of coffee, the aroma cutting through the sterile scent of paper and recycled air. She placed one on his desk, her eyes lingering on the report. "Closing the book on Trans-American?" she asked, her voice soft. "Just reading the latest from Henderson. It seems they're actually learning," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "The mandatory front-line hours for management are causing quite a stir. Apparently, the VP of Domestic Ops had to personally handle a lost baggage claim from a very irate wedding photographer last week. I imagine he has a newfound appreciation for his ground staff." Daisy allowed herself a small, wry smile. A little dose of reality can be a powerful teacher. She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze turning distant as she looked out the window at the distant, gleaming dome of the Capitol. "I saw an article this morning. Some business journal did a Where Are They Now piece. They found Brenda Walsh working as a cashier at a discount store in rural Wisconsin. The online comments were brutal." Mason sighed, the satisfaction he felt moments before tinged with a complex grayness. "I saw that. It's a strange feeling, isn't it? To see a moment of your own humiliation and pain become a public spectacle. To have the person who caused it become this cartoon villain for the whole world to mock." "She made her choice," Daisy said, her voice firm, yet not without a hint of weariness. "But you're right, it's unsettling. We weren't seeking public vengeance. We were seeking systemic correction." "Exactly," Mason affirmed. "And the two get conflated. People see the karma, the satisfying downfall. They don't see the tedious, unglamorous work of rewriting training manuals and compliance codes that follows. They don't see this," he tapped the thick report, "the real work. Brenda Walsh was a predictable product of a failed system, a system that didn't just tolerate her behavior, it rewarded it. Gary Peterson's memo praised her kind of aggression as efficiency. As long as the planes left on time, the human cost was irrelevant. We didn't just get one woman fired. We ripped out the entire incentive structure that created her." Their work had always required a degree of clinical detachment. They were surgeons of systems, not arbiters of personal morality. They had to analyze the failure points, diagnose the illness, and prescribe a cure, all without letting the raw emotion of the situation cloud their judgment. But this case had been different. They were both the surgeons and the patients. The violation had been personal, aimed directly at the core of their identity. It had been a stark, ugly reminder that no matter their titles, their degrees, or their authority to some people, they would always be seen first through the lens of their race. Daisy walked over to her own desk, which adjoined his, and picked up a letter printed on expensive heavy bond paper. The Trans-American Airways logo was embossed at the top in silver foil. Speaking of corporate maneuvering, the new COO, Mr. Davies, sent this by courier this morning. She handed it to Mason. It was an effusive, 2-page letter. filled with carefully crafted prose about a new dawn at Trans-American and their unwavering commitment to a culture of respect. The final paragraph contained the real purpose of the letter. And in the spirit of this new chapter, we would be deeply honored if you and Dr. Hayes would consider being the keynote speakers at our annual Corporate Leadership Summit in Aspen next spring. Your story and your invaluable perspective would be a powerful catalyst for change as we move forward. Mason read it and let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. Unbelievable. He wants to parade us on stage, put us on display as proof that they've changed. They want to absorb their biggest PR disaster and turn it into a success story. Look, the FAA inspectors we humiliated are now our friends. We're all better for it. It's the final step of corporate damage control, Daisy said, her analysis as sharp as ever. Step 1, deny. Step 2, apologize when caught. Step 3, fire the low-level scapegoats. Step 4, co-opt the narrative and monetize the redemption story. They don't want our perspective, they want our absolution. They want to buy it with a trip to Aspen and a speaking fee. He placed the letter on his desk, next to the closure report. The 2 documents told the whole story, the disease and the prescribed insincere cure. We'll be declining, of course, politely. And formally, Daisy added, reminding them that as federal regulators, our impartiality is paramount, and that we cannot accept honorariums or create any appearance of endorsement. It was a necessary boundary. Their power came from their unimpeachable position as objective enforcers of the law. To participate in Trans-American's carefully staged redemption tour would be to betray that core principle. Their work was done through audits and regulations, not applause lines and photo ops. Mason stood up and walked to the window, standing beside his wife. The city stretched out before them, a complex grid of power and purpose. Down below, life went on, oblivious to the near misses and systemic saves that happened in buildings like theirs every single day. Their work was, by its nature, invisible when it was done right. The public only ever saw the failures, the crashes, the scandals, the delays. They never saw the disasters that were averted by a well-written regulation or a meticulously thorough audit. He put his arm around Daisy's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. They had faced down ugliness and had channeled their justified anger into a force for profound and lasting change. They had won. It wasn't a victory that erased the sting of the insult, but it was a victory that would protect countless other people from suffering the same. "It's over," he said, quietly, more to himself than to her. "That chapter is closed." "Yes, it is," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder for a brief moment. "But the book is still being written." She was right. He returned to his desk and moved the heavy Trans-American report to the corner, placing it on a stack destined for the archives. From his inbox, he picked up a fresh file, a slim manila folder that felt deceptively light. He opened it. The title on the first page read, "Preliminary Report. Whistleblower allegations of uncertified parts usage at Phoenix Sky Harbor, Maintenance Hub, Western Eagle Airlines." His focus shifted instantly, the details of the Trans-American saga receding as a new, complex problem took its place. A different airline, a different city, a different kind of rot. The quiet echo of their work in Chicago would continue to reverberate, but their eyes and their minds were already moving on. They were watching the skies, just as they always did. The work was never, ever done. That day at O'Hare started with a disgusting act of prejudice, but it ended with a powerful lesson in accountability. The story of Dr. Parker and Dr. Hayes shows that sometimes the systems designed to protect us can actually work. It's a reminder that true authority isn't about a uniform or a title. It's about integrity, professionalism, and the courage to uphold the rules for everyone, no matter who they are. The karma that hit Brenda, Gary, and the entire airline wasn't magic. It was the direct result of a system being forced to correct itself in the most dramatic way possible. This one incident sent ripples through an entire industry, forcing a reckoning that was long overdue. What did you think of the consequences Brenda and her bosses faced? Were they fair? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story of justice satisfying, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more true stories of karma and accountability. Thank you for listening.